When I was asked to talk about the Indian luxury consumer, customer, whichever one way we define it, I was thinking about what title to use, and I think where I finally landed was around this, which is about demystifying Indian luxury. And there are several reasons that I would do that. One of the things that I would just start off with is the introduction that was given around the role that I play. As a BCG Fellow, I have explored the issue of how digital is changing consumer behavior and how digital companies are reacting to the change in consumer behavior. As we were talking in the panel, one of the things was Abheek is going to talk about a lot of facts and statistics. That's actually only half true. So I do have some facts and statistics, but in the classic way that Jeff Bezos talked about the fact that when data and stories collide, it's the stories that win. So I'm going to talk about some data, but actually some stories as well. I think you see 4 minis on this page, and some of you will very intuitively understand the points that I'm talking about as we move from the left to the right. But let me start with the first one. The way I describe it is there are multiple Indias. One simplistic way to think about Indias is the 3 Indias, and especially in the context of luxury, it's really the top of this, the 50 million people, which is the subset that one is talking about. I'm not talking about the really rich. I'm actually talking about the 50 million because one of the things which is there is this is the equivalent of Europe. This is the equivalent from a GDP per capita as the equivalent of Europe. We actually see consumers who are in this 50 million exhibiting behavior that you would think is reserved for the top 1 million, 5 million, 10 million. So this is the segment really that one can really think about. The second point, which is an obvious one to anybody who's walked the length and breadth of India, is the fact that if you think about geography, there are many Indias, and while not going through the numbers on this page, what you see different colors here and the different flags, this indicate the number of millionaires that each of the state on this page has corresponding to a country, number of millionaires, right? The fact that there are many Indias is not a surprise. I think this is something which I hear from clients who are in this space very often. One of the questions is, what is really the size of the luxury market in India? And just as an illustration, I looked at what the estimates from 3 different independent sources were. And you see the range being anywhere from 3 to close to 8. Now, what really makes the difference is A, the number of categories do you take in consideration here or not. The way we think about it is, of course, there is personal luxury, which is where most people would intuitively think about luxury. But there is also what I would call the durable luxury equivalent, which is either in terms of auto or in terms of gadgets, which actually increases the size. The third is around experiential luxury, which is around services, and that's a very important thing as we think about going forward. And the fourth is asset luxury, which is, in some sense, do you think of jewelry as personal luxury or asset luxury? Do you think about real estate as luxury itself or not? And if you take the most expansive definition, which is all 4 of them put together, the number actually becomes close to 8 times that you see on this page. The reason I'm saying it's still important to think about what the definition is depending on what really are you thinking about, the numbers could be significantly different. Therefore, to put one number out there is very misleading. Now, this comes to the interesting part, which is, as one thinks about India, of course, there's no average Indian consumer. It's like ice. I say, if your feet are in ice and your head is in the oven, on an average, you're not comfortable. You're uncomfortable both ways, right? So you can't say that there is an average which is there. But to my mind, and this is when I sent this presentation to the organizers, they said, actually, there is a typo. There's something missing in the title. And I say that there is not. The reason I say is because what you see on the left-hand side of this chart and on the right-hand side, and this is probably the most important thing to keep in mind, is there is a beauty and complexity of and. Everything that you will say about the Indian consumer on the left-hand side, you can also make the point that there is an and, which is slightly different, in some cases significantly different than what you see on the right. I'll take 2 or 3 examples here. The first, and to my mind, this is probably the single biggest defining trend which is going to define what's going to happen in India, not only from a luxury perspective, but an overall perspective, is the rise of women. In 1995, the percentage enrollment of girls or women in high schools and boys in high school, there was a 20 percentage point difference. 20 percentage point difference. You look at the chart over a period of time, the two start coming together. In 2015-16, something remarkable happened. In schools enrollment, percentage of girls enrolled overtook boys for the first time ever. Okay? First time ever. If you look at it 2020, actually the same thing has replicated in context of colleges. Now, why is this important? Because if you fast forward, the one thing which is going to happen is implication on workplace, implication in terms of employment, implication in terms of decision making. And if you look at the biggest difference between India and China, it's actually around the percentage of working women. Now, is that going to happen over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? I think that's an open question. But one of the reasons why the Chinese luxury market is so much more advanced in many of the categories is because of this. The second piece, which to my mind is one of those contradictions which is there, is around sustainability. The top of the pyramid equivalent actually says that they are concerned, they are aware, and they want to act on sustainability. At the same time, if you ask about convenience, they want convenience as well. Many times, the two actually are at cross purposes. Right? So how does this contradiction manifest itself is an important thing which is there. And the third, and there's a certain reason why I wore what I wore. We have been tracking consumer behavior in India for about 12 years through a panel. About 12 years back, in 2010, other things being equal, the Indian consumer on an average would prefer an international brands 2/3 of the time. Today, the number has reversed where Indian consumers would prefer other things being equal an Indian brand. 12 years back, it would have been very surprising for me or anyone to turn up for an event like this wearing something which was, partly Indian. You see increasingly more and more people actually doing that. Let's bring this to life. The one thing I did not want to fall into the trap of was to say, this is how the Indian consumer behaves. The one thing I would leave with is I have found actually the same consumer at different points of time for different needs and occasions actually behaves very, very differently. One of my colleagues and co-authors, Michael Silverstein, used to call it the Costco luxury consumer equivalent, right? Who would actually go to Costco and buy the normal goods because you get the best deal. You're still buying the brands that you want, but you're getting the best deal. And then, whether it's for fashion or anything else, you trade up. So you're trading up, but because you're trading up, per se, in some categories, you're going to be trading down. Now, if I take this archetype, and this is confident and expressive, this is an actual consumer who was in early 30s, who actually said, I actually love to flaunt what I have. significant spends, the brands into consideration, you can see the one important thing is the emotional needs while looking at fashion and accessories was what you see on this page. But the requirements when buying some of the other categories was very different. So for example, craftsmanship for Indian fashion was a very high requirement, but for Western fashion was very different. I think the one myth I do want to shatter is many times when the discussion is on luxury, the focus is on women. Actually, in India, the men's luxury segment is equally attractive, if not more, than the women's. This consumer that we talk to, actually, you see watches, etc., as in what he wants from watches. But the thing which stayed with me was he said, the category where I spend the most on is actually shoes. Not on the overall pairs of shoes that I own, but from a very functional perspective, I know that I'm going to wear my work shoes 10 hours a day in, day out. If I need to spend 5,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees, 15,000 rupees extra, it's worth it. Right? So a very practical attitude towards where to spend and how to spend. Moving on, and this is the thing which is, how do we think about the future? If you look at it on many parameters, India is where China was 15 to 20 years back. Interestingly, if you look at some of these parameters 7, 8 years back, the gap was actually less. So that time the lag was about 8 years. The interesting thing is, if you look at more luxury categories, the gap becomes 12, 15 years. If you look at more mass categories, the gap is lesser. That's just from a demand side. I think what is interesting is on the right-hand side, you see the elements around the demand, but I think what's more interesting is what's happening on the supply side, because the supply is actually creating some of its own demand. So I think the infrastructure investment across different parts, the digital enablement is going to be a key driver, which is going to create the Indian market. And the one way to capture the sentiment, and trust me, this data is correct. The first time I saw this, I actually asked my research team to say, can you please double check it? And then they double checked it and they triple checked it. If you look at the major indices, if you take 2000, 2010, and 2022, and very specifically 31st October 22, if you look at how the different indices, and if you just stayed invested in the indices and you changed as the index composition changed, most markets you would have got a 30-40% return. The US, your money would have become 2.7x. India, actually from 100 has become 1200. And if you look at the current numbers, it is, of course, since 31st October, these numbers have increased. The reason I'm putting it here is there is, in many of these, a sentiment which ends up playing out, and that's also positive. The one last piece is, I think India is going to be a cauldron where luxury is going to change. Technology is going to be one key driver of it. This is how it was in the past. This is how it could be going forward. Thank you very much.